You're listening to episode 18 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Mindfulness teacher Martin Aylward joins us to speak about mindfulness and sexual intimacy. As we grow in our formal meditation practice, mindful awareness becomes more present in the rest of our lives off the cushion. We find integration with the rest of our lives, realizing how often we've checked out. And just as we do during meditation, we bring ourselves more fully into what's happening in the here and now. Every moment is a new chance to wake up to what is before us. And this transformation includes emotionally and physically intimate aspects of being human. Martin Aylward traveled to India aged 19 to explore meditation. He spent most of the next 5 years in monasteries, ashrams, and meditation centers in India and Thailand, including 2 years in a hermitage in the Himalayas. Returning to Europe, in 1995 he co-founded with his wife Gail the Tapovan Dharma community in the French Pyrenees. Gradually, the number of visitors increased, and in 2005 they relocated to Les Moulins, a former Zen monastery in southwest France. Martin's teaching encourages and inspires a spiritual practice that both integrates meditation and the daily activity of our personal lives. Our guest today is mindfulness teacher Martin Aylward. Martin, welcome to Present Moment.
Hi, Ted. Nice to be here.
So tell us about your background. How did you first encounter mindfulness?
Well, getting into practice was really born of my adolescent angst and confusion, really. About 17, 18 years old, I just started to feel very disenchanted with the mainstream options that life seemed to be presenting to me in terms of further education or career, etc. And I had just a restless yearning for some depth and meaning in life that I didn't see being reflected back to me in the culture around me. This is late 80s. And so I quit after high school and went off traveling, thinking I would take a year or so to travel before going to university. And yet I found that the traveling and experiencing different cultures was sort of stimulating to that restless longing, which continued really until I got to India. And when I'd heard about meditation practice, I felt like, having followed this restlessness and existential crisis really for a couple of years, that meditation would be a way to actually engage directly with my mind rather than just following my mind around trying to placate it. And, that's how I came to practice. I went to a Buddhist meditation course, and I would say about 20 minutes in to the very beginning of the 10-day course, I just felt like, somebody who's found water in the desert, and I started to cry. It was a moment of great clarity, really, where it was totally clear to me, the relief, the sense that this was what that restless yearning had been searching for, a way of actually engaging with my consciousness and how it operated. and the very clear sense that I would spend the rest of my life doing this. I was just 19 at the time. In retrospect, I've always been very, very grateful to have found this practice while I was young and before my habit patterns had laid themselves down too rootedly in consciousness.
And so tell us a bit more about your ongoing education from that point. You had that wonderful experience. And how did you follow that? How did you pursue that education?
Well, I stayed in Asia for most of the next 4 or 5 years, actually, sometimes staying in long periods of silence and doing very intensive meditation practice in various Buddhist monasteries in India and Thailand and Nepal. And also I lived with a Hindu hermit monk in the Himalayas for about 2.5, 3 years in a kind of mountain solitude, really, just the two of us. And just very much an immersion in very traditional styles of mindfulness practice embedded in its original context, mindfulness practice as Buddhist practice. And periodically, when I would run out of money, I'd come back to the UK, which is where I'm from, and do a couple of months of any kind of work to go back again to Asia. And in one of those trips, I met the woman who became my wife, and in a rather unplanned and sudden way, she became pregnant very quickly. And even though I had no doubts about being with her and no doubts about us having a child, and I was kind of excited about the big change that meant for my life, I was struck by the fact that the model I had had for mindfulness practice until then, i.e. long retreats, intensive meditation practice, etc., wasn't going to serve me in family life. And so I had that reflection really, so the next 20 years or so, I'm not going to do any long retreats. The next 20 years or so, I'm going to need a different model for practice. And from then on, I became very interested in how to apply the depths of meditation and the kind of rigorous kind of full immersion practice that I'd been doing to a contemporary life, a lay life, a family life, an engaged life, etc.
And you found an interesting way to deal with that. Many of us who have day jobs, families, that kind of traditional structure often have difficulty creating and maintaining a regular practice. And one way you've addressed that, and to have that continued involvement and direct daily contact with your family, is to start your own retreat center. Why don't we talk about that a little bit right now?
Yeah. On retreats, people often ask me, how do I integrate mindfulness practice into my life? And for me, the question was always the other way around. It was, how do I integrate my life into this practice that I love? And that was, so central for me. And so rather than following a conventional life and seeing how I could be mindful in it, that actually didn't occur to me, I have to say. It was more like I wanted to really marshal all my resources in the support of going as deeply as I could into this practice, and then finding a lifestyle that would support that. So we came back from, our daughter was born in India, actually. And then we came back to Europe and we found a very simple place, no electricity, no running water. It was still somewhat conforming to the ascetic ideal of practice that I'd had in Asia, in the French Pyrenees. And we wrote to people we knew and said, look, we're here and we want to support people in their practice and support ourselves in our practice. Come and meditate with us. Come and stay little time or a long time. The first person that ever arrived at that place came and asked if he could stay for 3 days, and he stayed 8 years. So slowly a community developed around that, and we were at that place in the Pyrenees for 10 years. My teachers started to encourage or insist even, I suppose, for me to start teaching. And so then people started to come through that as well. And after 10 years had gone by, the place, which was very, very simple, as I say, and far from anything, I think it was about 12 miles to the nearest shop and a couple of miles even just to get out of the forest to the first tarmac road. But, too many people were coming and we couldn't really sustain that. And then somebody who had been supporting that place and coming to practice with us inherited some money, offered us the opportunity to look for another place. And so that was 8 or 9 years ago now that we moved to where we are now, the Moulin de Chauves, which is a very beautiful center in southwest France. It was a Zen monastery for 15 years before we moved here. So we got it with a purpose-built Japanese-style meditation hall and bamboo groves for walking meditation. And so that sort of further amplified our capacity to serve people in their practice and to hold retreats. And so that's what we do here in France.
And for folks who are interested in that, and I will link this on the episode page for this episode, you can find out more about that location at moulindechauves.org. But today we want to talk about something else. And this is based on a talk you gave at a conference recently in Boulder, Colorado, on mindfulness and intimacy. Tell us a little bit about that. What is that relationship? What's that look like?
Well, fundamentally, I would say all practice is about intimacy. I would say that intimacy is a synonym for mindfulness. That to be mindful actually is to be intimate with experience, to be so close to experience that the sense of subject and object, the observer and the observed, dissolve into one another. You know, it's kind of ironic that often we speak about, or we might hear of mindfulness practice spoken in a kind of opposite language. And we might speak about observing one's experience, getting some distance or some space or some perspective on one's experience. And even though that makes sense often, that language, I think what it can do is it can imply that one's looking at one's experience from some remove. And it tends to encourage a view of practice where one is sort of looking down at what's happening.
Yeah, that there is a distance from the experience rather than a direct engagement with it.
Exactly. And so one says, well, I'm trying to be mindful of my breath. But if there's that sense of distance or remove, then actually what tends to happen is it's like a looking at the breath through some imagery or some description or some idea of what's happening. Whereas actually what we're asked to do is really inhabit the breath with awareness, to absorb this extraordinary capacity we have to be aware of what's happening, to absorb it into what's happening. So one can apply that to breath and walking. One can apply that to the general investigation of one's experience. And there's this whole realm of experience, which we more ordinarily call the realm of intimacy, human intimacy, and particularly sexual intimacy, which seems to me to be a very, very potent realm for exploring some of the big and important and transformative themes of mindfulness. The realm where we actually get to experience great depths of bliss, the realm where we get to experience a sense of non-separation between ourselves and another. And, of course, it's also an area where powerful energies and powerful habit patterns and powerful desires are at work. And it's an area where also, because of the vulnerability and the potency and the beauty of intimacy, that also people can get into trouble, right? It's a realm where actually a lot of hurt and wounding and confusion happens. And I would imagine that nobody listening to this podcast, wherever they might be spread out throughout the world, would claim to be someone who's never been hurt or confused in the realm of sexual intimacy. And because of that, because there's the possibility for that, it seems to me that mindfulness teachings and Buddhist teachings from where they originally come, and in fact, generally most spiritual and religious and transformational teachings tend to kind of avoid the realm of sexual intimacy to a large extent. Avoid it or rely on a kind of rigid view about what's okay in terms of sexual intimacy, and then leave it alone, basically. And that seems partly not really good enough. I don't think it's serving people very well, and that can be so much more. One of the reasons it's not serving people well is that, mindfulness practice purports to bring awareness to all of human experience in order to investigate and understand and free up all human experience. But as we see, each of us, the realm of sexual intimacy actually takes up quite a lot of space and experience. Look at how often the mind goes to sexual fantasy or sexual desire or sexual imagery or sexual categorization or sexual objectification in some way or another. Right? Because it's so powerful, because it can be so beautiful, because it's so compelling, there's a kind of alarming, I would say, an alarming mismatch between how much the realm of sexual intimacy arises in our experience and how much these teachings that claim to really address the whole realm of experience don't address this area.
What do you see as the biggest gap in teaching of mindfulness, and in particular with this realm of physical intimacy? What's missing and what would help change that? What do people need to know and practice?
I think there are several things, one of which is some kind of, there's a problem with the word desire. Poor old desire gets a bit of a bad rap, a bad reputation. Bad rep. So partly this is a hung up from Orthodox Buddhism. And maybe it's a little better dealt with in the secular context. But it's like we're afraid of desire because it's so powerful. And because we're afraid of it, we try to damp it down or suppress it or something. That's not where we start. Where we start is we try to satisfy all our desires. And at some point, we find that there's a certain exhaustion to that. And no matter how successful I manage to be at satisfying this or that different desire, another one just pops up, and then, here we go again, and I've got to satisfy another one. And of course, that can be a lot of fun, and it can start to feel kind of hollow after a while in terms of its relentlessness. And in many cases, I think it's that kind of recognition that, no matter how much I chase around trying to have what I like and not have what I don't like, trying to obtain the pleasant and resist the unpleasant, it's like a hamster wheel. It just engenders more and more of the same. And you look at a hamster running around its wheel, it looks pretty certain that it's getting somewhere. It's pretty earnestly engaged, and yet it's just more of the same. And so when we have that kind of reflection, which in many cases is what brings people to look in a different direction for their happiness and well-being, to look maybe in the direction of mindfulness, it's easy to make the assumption that desire is to blame, the desires are relentless, etc. Therefore, I have to somehow get rid of them. And then we're busy trying to attain some kind of imagined peaceful state wherein no agitation happens, no desire happens. And the language of things like peace and stillness and spaciousness can get sort of co-opted by that view, as if the point of mindfulness is to attain a peaceful state. But of course, as one sees when one starts to meditate, and then as one sees after one's been meditating for a little while, and then as one continues to see whether one's been meditating for a very long time, peaceful state is hard to come by, right? States of mind are unreliable. They're changing all the time. Even when sometimes the mind does settle into a very peaceful state, it's not really as a result of something I've done. It's just true that sometimes the mind resolves into a certain peacefulness, but often it doesn't. Often it's being led around by all kinds of other movements and drives. And so the sense of the real peace of mindfulness isn't the attainment of a peaceful state, but rather a fluidity and freedom to abide peacefully with the mind in all its states. And so if we take that view in terms of desire, the opportunity to abide intimately with desire, with this force of wanting that lights up our experience, this force of wanting that itself is dynamic, creative, enlivening, But because it's a force that reaches out for something, we tend to kind of ride along on the desire and kind of get ahead of ourselves, fixating on the object of that desire. So one of the most helpful and powerful ways, I would say, to really work with desire and intimacy is to notice the tendency to fixate on the object. You, and you're the one I want. And to see if, rather than fixating on how I could get intimate with that object, to put it in rather mechanical terms, to see what value might there be in me being really intimate with the desire itself, the feeling of it, the energy of it, the arising of it, the dynamism of it, to feel that movement of desire, of longing, as it presents energetically, viscerally, to feel the way it rises from the core, from the genitals maybe, or from the belly center, the way it rises up and expresses as a longing in the heart. The longing of desire is a longing for intimacy, for closeness, for contact, for love. Yet easily we get persuaded that the contact and the intimacy and the love is to be found in the object. But of course, that finding, when it happens, and it may have some brief, exquisite moment of consummation in it, and then it just moves on to another object. So it's not that I have anything against that wonder and beauty of human intimacy and the exquisite coming together of subject and objects, if you like. But maybe there's some real intimacy and love and contact available, not just in the getting of an object, but in the movement itself. So the encouragement's there to love desire, to be intimate with desire, to really feel desire, to let it move and burn and rise up and express itself. And in that contact with it, we might find that in the longing itself is the love and intimacy that we're longing for.
And Martin, that's a fairly significant shift for people, however subtle it may be, between the difference of desire itself and the object of desire. What are some of the difficulties that you've observed in making that shift, in helping students make that shift and be more aware and more intimate of the desire itself?
Well, objects are compelling. That's our default mode. We walk around feeling like a subject called me, I, experiencing a world of objects called this and that, here and there, etc., etc. And one certainly can't talk oneself out of that view. We've grown up, and as adults, we've spent 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 decades reinforcing that view. And yet, really, the essence of mindfulness, as we bring close, caring, curious attention to what's actually happening, in other words, to this sense I have of a subject experiencing an object, then we start to find that the rigidity and the individualness, the selfness of objects dissolves a little bit. It's like, even now in the hearing of these words, the default assumption is that I'm a someone, subject, hearing what's being spoken, object. But if one applies not one's normal common sense that tells us that, but a rather uncommon sense, if we listen more deeply, not so much to the object of the words, but if we listen to the listening, what we find is, I can't find the place where the object ends and the subject begins. I can't find the place where the sound of the word ends and my hearing of it begins. And to contemplate that truth, moment by moment in any experience, is to drop into a greater intimacy. And so that dropping in really has to happen through again and again and again, noticing that I think I'm a subject experiencing an object, and being willing to look more closely, listen more closely, feel more closely. And I would say, in a way, that's what mindfulness practice is. It's that looking and listening and feeling more closely, so that the world of subject and object, the world where I feel myself to be a subject somehow cut off from the rest of life, the world where I feel my life to be a negotiation between this subject and those objects just can soften. And in that closer listening, that closer sensing, that closer participation in life, there we find our intimacy with all things. And so working with students is an encouragement and a reminder to look and listen and feel more closely, particularly to listen not so much to the story or content of our experience, but to sense into the actual process of it as it's playing out. To listen not so much to the seeming subject or object, right, the way the world seems to appearing and the way I describe it to myself, but to the actual fluid, moving experience itself.
Yeah, and I think there is sometimes an arising of a hesitancy or a foreignness to this idea of just being a part of ongoing process, of ongoing experience. And yet that's where tremendous growth comes from. That's where tremendous, as you're saying, intimacy comes from.
Well, there's an irony that that's both what we really long for, right? That's what we do this kind of practice for. It's like, I long to feel intimate with all things. I long to drop my wandering, willful mental activity. I long to drop into, I get all excited when I hear someone talking about intimacy and I say, yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want. And yet, at the same time, I resist that very intimacy hugely because it's very threatening to the worldview that we've come to rely on, to the self view that we've come to rely on. So I think in many ways, this practice that we're framing as a practice of intimacy is the tension between honoring the longing for that intimacy that is what keeps us practicing and adhering to this beautiful vision, this liberating vision of practice. And at the same time, to honor the fact that part of us really doesn't want that, is scared of that, is threatened by that, and is trying to maintain the status quo of usual self-sense and usual worldview through the constant making things into objects and then pursuing them or rejecting them, depending on whether they're liked or disliked.
Martin, you work with students on this in a program you have called Work, Sex, Money, Dharma. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. So about 5 or 6 years ago now, I put this program together really to address the fact that I was working with people a lot in a retreat setting. And, it struck me that in a meditation retreat, you get some really great, precise, tailored instructions on how to meet your meditation practice. And then at the end of the retreat, you tend to get one overall instruction for the whole of the rest of your life called be mindful. And that's a very good instruction. I totally support that instruction, but it doesn't tend in itself to be nuanced enough to really support us. And so when we go back to our working lives and our intimate relationships and our dealings with money, often people feel like they drown in that stuff or they get taken over by that stuff. And then they're trying to compare their sense of their mindfulness practice back to how it was when they were on retreat. And that's a really, really unfair comparison. Setting yourself up to imagine, why isn't my meditation practice like it was on retreat? What's the matter with me? Well, nothing's the matter with you. The conditions have changed. Of course, it's not going to be like that. So I wanted to find a way to really support people in their practice in the midst of their relational lives, their financial lives, their working lives. And initially, the way I set that program up was that I've been teaching it in various cities around the US and Europe and in Asia as well, actually. And it would run over the 2 days of a weekend, all day Saturday and Sunday, and then through the evenings of the weekdays following, Monday to Thursday. So people were basically maintaining their lives and the details and dramas of their lives and constantly touching base with practice and guidance and teacher support and dialogue with each other. And I found it very inspiring and beautiful, actually, to bring that kind of context to people in the midst of their lives. And the responses from people were really were powerful. It was interesting to see how people's expectation was, oh, well, the really deep stuff happens on retreat. So, but this will be interesting. And actually, they were very, in some cases, shocked, I think, to find just how provocative it could be in some ways and how transformational. And so, as well as working with some meditation practice and teachings, I also get people to do a lot of interrelational practice during that course, dialogue exercises with each other and bringing the light of awareness really into that realm while they're living it. There's a certain usefulness, of course, in retreat. Retreat is set up to really maximize the supportive conditions for meditation practice. So you don't want to be referring back to the complexities of people's daily lives all the time. But it seems to me increasingly really important to provide support and teachings for people in the midst of those daily lives. That was what this course wanted to address. And having taught it around the world for the last 5 years or so, at the beginning of this year, I made it into a month-long online course, which has run a couple of times now. And similarly, I've been very moved by just how transformative that's been for people and the feedback on the course. So that course will run again in some point in the new year.
Yeah, integration is always one of the biggest challenges when one comes back from retreat and the conditions are set up to be optimal, and then you're back in your daily life. And that's always a bit of a challenge for folks.
Yeah. And the main challenge, I think, comes from the tendency to reinforce them as different. And of course, one can point to all kinds of superficial differences, right? Oh, well, I'm sitting more, I'm talking less, etc., etc. But hey, life is constantly full of change in superficial differences. And just the light in the room I'm sitting in has changed a lot since we started speaking, as it's near the end of the day. And the sounds outside my room. And, if we just look at superficial conditions, life's constantly changing. So let's better look at the deeper features of life that are more reliable than the superficial conditions. And those deep features don't really change at all from retreat to daily life. So I think that's what's worth emphasizing. The fact that my experience is happening right here, in this body, in this moment. That breath and sensation and thoughts and feelings are just unfolding freely within awareness. And that when I notice and acknowledge that fact, I can engage with that flow of thoughts and impressions and feelings. I can engage by, first of all, being really contactful, which is part of what we mean by mindfulness, sensing my body, sensing what it's like to be in this body right now. Its contact with the ground, the sense of air on my skin, whatever particular stands out as happening. I can engage with it by being curious, by actually exploring my experience with awareness, rather than just taking it at face value and reacting to it. That curiosity that kind of senses into what's happening in order to find out, what is this? What's moving right now? How come it's moving like this? What kind of reactivity might be driving this along, etc. And one can engage with one's experience by caring for it, by holding it all gently, by being really tolerant of and open to and willing to experience whatever this is right now. So I would say those three inherent qualities of awareness, contact, curiosity, and care. If our practice is about that orientation of being contactful and curious and caring for what's happening, then there's no difference between being in retreat and being at work and being at home and being with one's lover and dealing with money, etc., etc. The orientation is sustainable in all circumstances. But the particular quality of our practice, just how sharp our awareness is, just how grounded we are, just how sensitive we are to what's happening in the body, that's always going to be dependent on conditions. So I would say the main thing of that sense of integration, don't compare your practice in daily life qualitatively to how it was on meditation retreat. that's just a setup for failure, a setup for disappointment and discouragement and disaster.
Yeah, you're setting up an expectation of a particular goal. And although it's great to have goals, it's great to have expectations because they can help us plan and make for better futures for ourselves. We can also get a little too bunched up in our attachment to that outcome. And life sometimes has other ideas, and our ideas about what those conditions aren't always so.
Exactly.
Well, our guest today has been Martin Aylward. You can find out more about his work on his website, martinaylward.com, which I will be linking on the episode page, along with worksexmoneydharma.com and molindeshave.org. Martin, thank you for joining us on Present Moment.
Thanks very much, Ted. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.